Welcome to the Beyond Physio podcast, where we help you move, excel, and inspire others on your journey to your next level with knowledge and advice from experts and testimonials from our like-minded community.
Mike, I want to thank you for coming onto our podcast. Not only have you become a friend, also a patient and recovered from many different injuries, but today what I want to do on the podcast is talk about your expertise. And what really piqued my interest, Mike, was that there was a focus on youth, and there was some other components to that I want to get into. But I think we can both agree that creating the right kind of environment for our kids today, as far as what exercise looks like, what health looks like, and helping to build that right capacity environment for them to thrive, not only now, but also 30 years from now. I think we're both in that same sort of mission as far as getting that to be taken care of. So let's dive into it. Mike, can we talk about your academic background?
Sure. I mean, I came out of a university at UNC Chapel Hill with a history degree. And I went to work in professional baseball on the management side for about 10 years.
Yeah.
And then I decided I wanted to go back to graduate school and eventually I wanted to teach. And so I went back and got a master's in exercise and sports science at East Carolina, and then eventually my PhD at NC State. In that process, what I really learned was how much I enjoyed research and social science research in particular, that I wasn't anticipating going in. And so I spent 4 years on the faculty at Texas A&M University with a focus in youth development, and then had a chance to come back to NC State about 11 years ago, working in the sport management side, but with a research focus on sport and health, and particularly around youth sport and youth physical activity.
Cool. So how do we go from that level of research and whatnot into where you were diving specifically into the youth population?
Yeah, as I got the chance to start doing research, I was working with some colleagues at NC State that were really focused on how do we look at physical activity and sport from the perspective of what was really becoming an epidemic of obesity, not only childhood obesity, but also in relation to adult obesity as well. And so we started looking at certain trigger points, and one of which was middle school, high school kids who are dropping out of sport, not being active, and how that's translating into adult levels of physical activity. Because there's a ton of research out there that says, one of the biggest predictors of whether or not you're a physically active adult is whether or not you're a continually physically active child and adolescent. And so lots of kids are active as young children. But as they get into adolescence, they're not playing sport, they're not being active. And kind of our premise was not that they're not motivated to be active. It's just that the structures and the systems and the programs aren't there to support that. And so because of that, there's nothing for them to do.
So then, Mike, back in our day, I know phys ed, we had to take PE. And whether you played a sport or not, and sometimes you were lucky to get out of PE, but I remember for all of my secondary education, that I had to take some sort of PE class during a semester that I wasn't playing sport. But it seems to me like that has changed quite a bit in this current sort of generation of going to school and physical education.
Right. Well, a lot of that came from policies back in the early 2000s around testing and very test-focused education. And so, and to be fair, PE policies up to the states. So some states have more PE than others. North Carolina, for example, you have to take one semester of phys ed in high school. That's it. And in other states, there might be more. So what we're seeing was that when we had less mandatory physical activity, one of the things we lost in that process was what we call physical literacy. And so kids who don't have that education in how to be physically active aren't going to go out on their own and do it, because one is they don't know how to play a sport. They don't know how to go out. Even going to the gym is very intimidating if you don't have that kind of bridge through physical education to learn how to do those things. And so, and because adolescents are very conscious about that, they're not going to do it. They don't feel like they have some level of competence to pursue that activity.
It's really concerning for me because of the things that we see in adults now. And it's funny because we tend to see a lot of adults now who were really active as kids in college. And then somewhere in the 20s, they sort of dropped off, the workout wagon and whatnot and put some weight on and everything. And then they had a resurgence back in their 30s once they had kids and stuff like that. But at least they had, 10, 20 years of solid activity as a foundation. But now what I'm worried about, based on what you're saying, Mike, is that now we have kids who had no physical competency at all, or any kind of baseline foundation of movement. And now they're going to be in the 20s and 30s with other kinds of issues that might be even worse than what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That is something that should concern us as a society. There's a theory called the leisure repertoire theory, and Subway Zahola coined that. And the idea is that the leisure activities that you learn in your childhood and adolescence are what you're going to continue with in your adulthood. And so the more activities you do as a child and as an adolescent means that you have more to draw from, because certain things you can't continue to do physically as you get older.
Yeah.
But as you have a larger repertoire of these activities in which you can do, and some of them being physical activities, some of them being other types of activities, those are more likely what you're going to continue with. You're less likely to pick up new types of activities in adulthood.
That's concerning for me because I would say that, I don't know whether you believe in evolution or intelligent design, but we were made to move. Our bodies were clearly made to move. And so two things that bother me, two things I want to bring up. Number one is that these kids are not getting exposure the motor systems are not getting exposure to movement or to that rigor or to the kinds of things that keep our joints healthy. Instead, from what I understand, a lot of kids on their phones, of course, but also video games. And these are things that are only leading to more sedentary issues for these kids, but they're also not getting the chance to become the best version of themselves when they're not engaging in physical activity.
Right. And I had a graduate student several years ago, and she was working, she was primarily focused on physical activity at the community level.
Mm-hmm.
And she talked about how, as a society, we're engineering movement out of our days. And it's becoming so much easier to be sedentary. We don't have to leave our houses. We don't have to leave our cars. And so if you don't have those opportunities to move, then it's becoming less likely that you will move. And what's interesting is, again, we have a natural inclination, particularly as children, to move. If you watch kids, they want to play, they want to move.
Always,
We've done research on playgrounds. We know that kids have this natural innate ability to move. In fact, we had a study that found that one of the biggest inhibitors of kids' activities on a playground for young kids was the presence of a parent. So if the parent wasn't there, kids were moving a lot more, and because they weren't being as watched. So there's a definite inherent desire to move. And so as they get older, though, what's culturally appropriate, what's socially appropriate for these kids to be involved in changes. And so again, in a perfect world, you have physical education. So for everyone to learn how to be active, as well as kind of make them have activity.
Yeah.
And then you have sort of more casual, whether it's intramural sports or whether it's, other kind of non-competitive physical activities, whether, that's free in the school or somewhere, dance, chances to play intramural sports. For those that are interested in doing more, that's available to them. And then you have the competitive sports for those that can. Because right now, the system that we have that prioritizes, in the schools at least, competitive sports, leaves a lot of kids out. And it really just provides an opportunity for those kids who are already good at sports, that are playing club sports, to then come and play in the school team. And so we're losing those spaces for kids to be active that aren't competitive or aren't skilled.
I want to come back to that in a second, because the other problem that I saw, and back, I would say 20 years ago, one of the first classes I took, because I had a real keen interest on youth sports. I love working with kids. I spent some time doing pediatric physical therapy, and there are very unique injuries that happen with a growing skeleton that you don't see in adults. And as a result, sports science for kids was actually sort of just kind of coming into play. And even at the time, it was very rare to see a 13-year-old, 12-year-old with an ACL injury. In fact, I was fortunate to see that process happening, because it was at a time when these pediatric orthopedists were trying to figure out what kind of screw do we need to use for the ACLs, because they have to dissolve, they can't affect the growth plate. So there's a lot of this stuff going on, which is kind of cool to see. And being part of that rehab process for those kids was really awesome. The problem that we were seeing, and the reason why ACLs were becoming more prevalent, was these kids were becoming sports specialists. So you had the couch potato kids, and then you had the kids who were doing every sport, perhaps, and maybe doing the same sport all year round, multiple leagues, rec league, club team, and school team, not getting any kind of rest.
Right.
And of course, they're going to break down at some point. They're also not eating very well. So they don't even have the nutritional foundation to be able to recover from these kinds of things on top of schoolwork and whatnot. And so the ACL rate of tearing went through the roof, I would say, in anywhere between 2010 to 2015. We saw a massive surge in all these kids coming with ACLs, and everyone was like, "The hell's going on out there?" And then we sort of found in the research that it was because a lot of these kids were doing the same sport all year round. And I remember I was talking on another podcast with Shane Willis on hockey, ice hockey, and he had spoken how the great one was talking about how he was upset because back in his time, they would, in the springtime, play lacrosse and wintertime play ice hockey. And for him to see that these kids were playing ice hockey all year round was really concerning. And he was really upset that this wasn't more regulated or was more oversight over this to make sure the kids were getting some variety in the movements.
Yeah.
But I think that unfortunately this whole wave has come where now parents feel like FOMO when they see that, well, if Jimmy is playing, in these different clubs, I have to make sure that my Jimmy is also playing those things. Now it becomes this whole like parental cultural family dynamic, which has been really distressing, I think, for me as a physio, seeing that, hey, maybe your kid needs a break.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, lots of stuff there. Yeah. Well, obviously, yes, the increase of overuse injuries in adolescent athletes is alarming, and it's at a high rate, and it is coming from specialization. Early specialization is one of the worst things that's happened to youth sports.
Yes.
A lot of it, I could get into all of the minutia of this, but it's all about money, and it is. We have a privatized youth sports system in the U.S. And the motivation for whatever good comes out of it, the motivation is still how can we monetize this experience? And you couple that with what we've seen in particularly white middle class, but it's certainly crosses race and economic classes, is a pressure for families to feel like their kids, if they miss out, they're going to lose out on something. And so
opportunities, something.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so the clubs put this pressure on, coaches put the pressure on. We saw this with our study on COVID return to play, where we saw parents that may not have wanted their kids to go back and play sport yet. They weren't feeling very comfortable with that, feeling pressure, external pressure that if I don't, then my kid's going to fall behind and they're not going to get that chance. And so all the research says that you should be playing multiple sports. We did a study with the Aspen Institute, on the Healthy Sport Index, and what we wanted to find was what are those complementary sports. So if you want to be an elite soccer player, what's the other sport you need to do to work the other muscles that you need, or the other kind of pieces of that puzzle, like whether that's swimming or something else that can kind of complement. It's going to make you a better soccer player, but it's going to make you just a healthier human as you grow.
Yeah.
And so again, the Aspen Institute, right? They were really focused on how do we make youth sport better, and this was a big part of that. To try how do we pull back from sport specialization early, because again, there's no evidence that it actually is beneficial in the long run, and in fact, could be very detrimental, because we do see it leading to overuse injuries, we see it leading to burnout, we see it leading to stress and anxiety, and ultimately, the number one reason why kids quit sport is because it's not fun anymore. And so playing the same thing over and over again in this high pressure environment, because you're trying to pursue a goal outside of like some next level kind of goal, is going to lead to stress and anxiety among these kids.
And I worry about the kids and their mental health. Like you said, that the stress and whatnot, both on the parent, but really on the child too. And what it does for that child to, let's just say they were vying for a spot in their club team or maybe a varsity team, what have you. And there's a lot of competition. And of course, we know there's a very small percentage of athletes who get to play Division I and whatnot. If that was their lifelong goal, is there any evidence on what this has done I can guess what the evidence is, but have you seen any research on what that does for the kids and what that leads to?
Oh, there's definitely research in the elite youth sports, and it's limited, but there's definitely research that would suggest that kids who play youth sport at that high level feel higher levels of stress and anxiety. What we also see is kind of on the opposite side. As in some of the studies we looked at in middle school kids, and what we were concerned about was these opportunities not being there, and also how kids were their perspectives on sport. How were they kind of defining sport? And they were increasingly seeing it solely as this vehicle to get scholarships and play professionally or whatever that was. So,
Great job.
yeah, so if you're a kid
Yeah.
who wants to play basketball and maybe loves basketball, but then you get cut from the basketball team, they're going, well, why do I want to play basketball anymore? Because now I'm obviously not good enough to go get a scholarship, so I don't need to play basketball anymore. And so because they were defining it in these terms of it's only for this next level, then yeah.
So then and I can see why your research is so important, Mike, because now these kids who have used these sports as a vehicle to get somewhere, figuring out that they can't get to that place, now they have no other options except to just not do anything. And so what does that lead a lot of kids to do then at that point?
I mean, for some, they find other productive hobbies and that, but for a lot, it's a very sedentary, home on your phone, maybe even watch computer, watch TV.
Yeah.
It's there's a lot of research in that, and we get into the details of more risk behaviors that are seen in young people who don't participate in sports. So, and some of that may just be time related, that idle time, but there's lots of potential issues for these kids who don't have those outlets to play. And we know that there's great evidence about being physically active and this connections to cognitive development
100%.
and psychological well-being. And so doing better in school is going to come from being active. If you are active, you're also going to get along with everybody a little bit better. And so you're just better. Yeah. So there's just lots of benefits from that aren't being realized, not only when the kids aren't playing sport, but also when sports being organized in a way that doesn't allow those benefits to come to the kids that are playing.
Mike, what do you think the solution is here? Because I'm just thinking like, wow, you have to almost change an entire generation by putting the right policies in place to get kids to think differently about activity and sports so that they don't get stuck on this downward spiral that a lot of kids right now are going through.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge, and it's a multi-level, multifaceted process. I mean, we have to, obviously, I'm a big believer, and we need funding for physical education in school. I think that's one step, as well as for school sports that they go beyond competitive sports, so that there's free outlets for that. Because again, the private sector is only going to provide a service that can be paid for. So especially as parents are now demanding that they want their kids to have the best coaching, they're wrapped up in this idea that my kid's going to make it to college on a college scholarship, and so unfortunately, as long as the parents are driving that, the market's going to respond to that.
Right.
And so I think that there's kind of an obligation we have societally to fund at the governmental level, which I think the schools become the best avenue for that, to have, again, physical education, to have intramurals and more sort of non-competitive physical activities that kids want and kids are involved in the planning of, and they're involved in kind of organizing it so that it's things that they want to do. They don't have, the transportation is not an issue.
That's right.
Cost is less of an issue. So I think we have to have that, because and to be fair, as a society, we're going to pay for this somewhere, whether that's in health costs, whether that's in lost productivity, whether that's in inability to fill positions in the military. I mean, there's all kinds of implications to this that it's going to cost us at some point. So this is a great way in which to invest, I think, and that should be invested in our kids, because again, I don't believe that the market is ever going to shift in a way that's going to do good, especially if the parents are demanding this. So.
Yeah. You've probably seen that clip of physical education in the 60s where like these kids have no shirts on and they're just like, everyone's jacked.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that is a far cry. We are a far cry from where we were back then. And I kind of wonder if something drastic has to happen so that we can really kind of put things on the radar again and say, listen, this has to change like yesterday. Like 5 years ago and really get people, I would say, from the community. I agree with you where unfortunately when the market drives things and parents are going to be pushing that envelope a bit, it's going to be hard to change for sure. I remember one of our teams that we are partnered with up in New Jersey. It's a really well-known soccer league, highly competitive female youth soccer. And even the owner, really great guy, and even he was conflicted because he would even say from England, they don't do a lot of the things that we do over here at that age because they're still doing a variety of sports and the levels are just different and they start specializing as they get older. Whereas when they came to the States, he was almost appalled. And then dealing with parents, we'll just say, very interesting, coming from over at the UK, seeing how much they were so driven compared to UK parents to getting their kids to certain levels because of scholarships and what have you. And so he was kind of in this conflict where it was like, I want to do right by the parents and the kids and really by the kids. At the same time, it's also my livelihood. So there was definitely some struggle there because I don't think he realized how big it was going to get, number one, and how much of a push these parents had because of whatever things they're going after, aspirations. But definitely a very hard thing to deal with.
Yeah, and I don't want to, kind of pick on like the soccer clubs and all this because again, I don't think anybody that's coaching or is thinking about I want to drive these kids, I want to make money off them at this level. I simply think that they're right that if they don't sort of serve their customer base in this way, which is who's driving. I mean, let's be honest, it's the parents that are driving this model, and in particularly parents that feel like if I pay for something, I want to get the best for my kid, and that's understandable,
For sure,
particularly when you have the ability to pay.
Yes.
So but at the same time, I think systemically something has to change, and in those countries like England, for example, or the UK, where they have lottery funding that goes to grassroots sport, that's something we don't have in the U.S. We're the only country, Western country, so to speak, that doesn't have direct government funding of grassroots sports.
That's interesting.
And so I think that there is some implication to that when clubs have to be entrepreneurial, when national governing bodies have to be entrepreneurial in order to generate revenue to exist and to compete. Then the market's going to be driving a lot of these decisions.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate. And it's funny because it's across many different sports. My girls played club volleyball. So I got to travel with the team and we provided physio for the entire club. And that was a great experience. And being with my daughter in that time was really awesome. But certainly I could see the demands on her physically were coming up and it was hard, definitely between traveling and the schoolwork and then relationships on the team and then training and sports, strength and conditioning. I mean, it was a lot on these kids. And I'm thinking, well, in my mind, I'm thinking, I mean, it's just like total onslaught of different kinds of things all at once. And so it almost, unfortunately, prevents kids from living a kid's life, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, increasingly at a younger age, they're really becoming professionals.
Yes.
And to be fair, I mean, I kind of live the same thing. I mean, Molly, my oldest, played soccer at a high level. I tried to get her to choose other sports. She was solely focused on soccer, and that was her decision, despite our best efforts to try to get her interested in other things.
Base too, right?
Right. So I knew that, but again, she was driving the bus. Mary, our youngest, has also played soccer, but she sampled a lot more sports. And our rule has always been you have to play a sport. Like you have to play a team sport. Like I don't care what it is, and you can change every time, but there's just enough evidence where I know that you need to play a team sport at some level.
Definitely.
And so I think with Mary, she's chosen soccer because maybe her big sister did it, but also I think she doesn't necessarily want to try anything new. She's happy with what she's doing now, but not playing at the same level. So
that's cool. So Mike, let's talk about rural health because I was really interested in learning more about your research in that area. And I don't know enough about what it's like as far as the health, the risks, what happens to youth in the rural areas of North Carolina. Can you talk more about that?
So I grew up in rural North Carolina, and I remember as I was getting into the research around youth physical activity and sitting in a conference and talking about a lot of the ways in which we wanted to get kids active. And it was really focused on built environments. So how do we create more park space and then walking and biking to school and active transportation, things like this. And I realized that what they were describing was very much dependent on an urban structure, right?
Right.
Where you had higher density populations and infrastructure for mass transit and things like that. It wasn't resonating with the experience that I grew up with. And I also connected with other researchers that were kind of feeling the same way. And in that process, as we learned, you know, childhood obesity rates were much higher in rural areas, particularly in the rural South. There were a lot more racial disparities in terms of health disparities in the rural South, which is where most of my colleagues were researching. And the opportunities to be physically active were very different. For example, sport as a physical activity was much more important to youth in rural areas because they don't have that. They're not going to be able to walk to school. They need a program of some sort,
Yeah.
and they need transportation of that program. And so that was something that just didn't come up in this research.
Oh, wow.
And so learning about what this looked like, and part of it was talking with other researchers. There was a couple of issues that came up. One is most of the researchers that are doing research are located in more urban areas. And so it's just a natural thing to study where you are. The other thing is there are misconceptions that kids who grew up in rural areas were still working on farms. They were out hiking in the woods.
That's what came to mind.
Things like that. And the realities are that, we find that parents in rural areas are now commuting more and more into urban areas. So
Really?
kids are at
Yeah.
home alone more often. That there's fearful about kids going out in the community and walking out there on the roads as they are in urban areas. And there's certainly some issues that just weren't necessarily coming out in the research before we started studying these issues. And so we as a collective group started really studying a little bit more about kind of what were some of these barriers and facilitators of physical activity in rural areas. And it's actually some projects that have continued on today. Right now, we're working with a grant with the USDA that's and one with the CDC that are focused on different communities in North Carolina and different counties with that are at high risk of obesity.
Yeah.
And trying to understand like how we can work in those communities with extension, agricultural extension here in North Carolina as a facilitator of programs of support, of capacity building for some of these communities. So some interesting things.
Would you say that the health of kids, physical health of kids in rural North Carolina or in any of these areas is necessarily worse than kids who are in urban areas?
I think it's different. I mean, I would certainly say that the rates of obesity seem to be higher in rural areas. I think that if you look at the county health indices that come out each year, you will find that the unhealthiest counties in North Carolina are the rural counties. And a lot of that is adult morbidities but there is some evidence that the markers among youth is fairly similar.
Is that like an educational kind of thing? Like as far as like maybe not that they're any less intelligent, but maybe there's less access to education about health?
I think there's a couple of things. One, I think there's certainly an income gap. I mean, there is a lower median household income, and with that becomes certain access to better nutrition and physical activity. We know there's relationships between socioeconomic status and physical activity, for example. So there is a concentration of lower SES and higher poverty in these areas than you find in more urban counties. You also have a lot of our food deserts in North Carolina are going to be in those rural areas.
Really?
And so having access to grocery stores and fresh fruits and vegetables is something that is going to be much more likely in an urban area than a rural area.
Wow. It's funny because like you said before, like I was thinking, well, they're on the farm, they must have access to farm fresh foods and stuff like that, but that's actually not the case.
No, and most of our farming in North Carolina is corporate farming. So
that's crazy. So it sounds like we have kids or the health of our future generation. There are issues at the urban level, whether it's a sports specialist, whether it's a child who has not had the knowledge of how to move correctly. And then you have kids in the rural areas who, for many different reasons, also may not have access to different kinds of activities. So it seems like it's almost across socioeconomic strata that you have issues.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there's really no group that's untouched. I mean, certainly having higher level education, obviously having higher financial resources is going to open more doors for accessibility to physical activity and better nutrition. There's no doubt about that. I think one thing I didn't mention, which is interesting in more rural areas, which kind of gets back to some of our conversations on sport.
Yeah.
What we're seeing more and more is the struggle for some of these communities to maintain some of the traditional sports they've had in the town.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is driven by those few families in these areas who had the ability to drive their kids to the more urban areas to play on those travel teams, to play on those. And so now there's not enough kids to form the teams or the leagues in the local area. So and so those leagues are actually falling apart.
So even fewer options out there then. Oh my gosh. Like, I think it does actually concern me, like how we're going to pay for this. And I can see full circle why the solution is so hard, because there are so many different points of so many areas of opportunity, really, but at the same time, so many areas that need to be addressed across the areas.
Well, there is, and I think another thing is I think a societal mindset that physical activity in sport is something that is a necessity. It's a lot of times it gets sort of thought of as something that's nice to have. It's extracurricular, like we need, and I think even going back to those school policies of like no child left behind, that we've got to focus on test scores without understanding what these other things like sport, how it complements that, right? And so I think we have to realize that health, and particularly physical health and mental health and psychological health of our young people, why that's so important to us as a society, but also as they become adults, why we want them to be healthy and have healthy lifestyles. And we have to think about it in those terms first before we will say that's something we need to spend money on.
Yeah. Mike, thank you so much for sharing your research and getting to know you better also. You definitely piqued my interest to think of ways that maybe we can be involved somehow to spur this on. I know it's going to be a huge endeavor because there's so many people, so many lives affected by this, but it definitely has my gears turning as far as what can be done, because for the sake of our country here and the sake of the health of our kids getting to adulthood later on, man, this is it's almost like worse than obesity, I would say, in some ways, because these kids don't have options in different ways, or they're struggling because they're doing too many things and they can't get the kind of recovery they need. So yeah, man.
Yeah, honestly, our system right now is unhealthy.
Yeah.
I mean, whether it's the high level sport or the complete lack of sport, it's not healthy for our youth right now. And so I feel like it is something we have to pay attention to, because we're missing out on what we could be doing as a country, and is something that I believe we owe to our kids.
Yeah. For any parents, we have a lot of parents on our podcast. I'm a parent myself. Mike's a parent too. I think the take-home message for me right now is that there are little changes that we can make with our family right now. And if you have young kids and you're listening to this podcast, this is a great opportunity for you to maybe consider or reconsider the activity level, or how important activity is in your kids to become the best version of themselves. After all, we're all just trying to get to our next level. We're all trying to do the right thing. And sometimes even well-intentioned plans may end up being harmful to our kids. But hopefully, with Dr. Mike sharing his knowledge base on what he has seen in the research and across all different socioeconomic strata, that there are issues that every single area has that we can really help to maybe even change the trajectory for how our kids are going to be in the next 10, 20, 30 years. It all starts with us. So I hope that you take this as an inspiration, and that you take this also as a warning that, there are things that might happen that we may pay for in the future because of the decisions that you and I make as parents right now, especially as pertains to the physical health of our kids. Mike, thank you so much for coming on our show.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for tuning into today's episode. It really does mean a lot to us. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe, or comment if you got at least one or two helpful insights or takeaways to help you get to your next level.